I suppose that all old books have some controversies about them, some things we just aren't quite sure about. One of the reasons for that is because almost never do we actually have the manuscript as it was written by the author. So, you want to read what Thomas Aquinas wrote. The problem is that essentially we don't have any of Thomas Aquinas' what we would call autographed manuscripts. Or we don't have Dante's autographed manuscript of the Divine Comedy. Well, we also don't have it for Machiavelli's The Prince. And one of the interesting things is, since the book was only published in the 1530s, although it was written in 1513, is we think that there are a couple places where Machiavelli fixed it up a little bit in later years. And one of those is the dedication. Because we're pretty sure that in 1513, when Machiavelli wrote The Prince, he wrote it and dedicated it to a guy named Giuliano de' Medici, who had the rather interesting title, French title, of the Duke of Nemours. But in 1516, he died. And as far as we can tell, Machiavelli changed the dedication then to another Medici prince, or as one modern historian has referred to him rather disparagingly, as a princelet. And therefore, as you pick up a printed version of Machiavelli's The Prince today, you will see it dedicated, this is confusing, to Lorenzo de' Medici the Magnificent. Now, as I mentioned in the last lecture, this is not the Lorenzo the Magnificent. This is a Lorenzo the Magnificent. In fact, the grandson of the one we usually call the Magnificent. The very fact that Machiavelli refers to him as the Magnificent, like his grandpa was, suggests again perhaps there's a tone of flattery in the dedicatory letter. By the way, let me just point out that as I read some passages in our analysis of The Prince in the next few lectures, I'll be reading from a new translation by Peter Bondinella. There are many good translations of The Prince, and it's easy to find references because The Prince is divided into relatively short chapters. The book is less than 100 printed pages, and there are 26 chapters in it. So always I will refer to chapter numbers rather than page numbers. That way, whatever translation anybody has, it'll be easy for him or her to find the passage that I'm talking about. But I'm using this brand new Bondinella translation, brand new as of, I think, the fall of 2005. Well, what does Machiavelli say in this dedicatory letter? He says, I want to send you a gift. And then, almost in a comical way, and Machiavelli's not a laugh-a-minute guy, let's remember. He says, most people would send you a horse, some nice gewgaw, that's my term, not Machiavelli's, but I'll tell you what I'm going to send you. I'm going to send you what I've learned. I'm going to send you a writing that's based on my study of the ancient past, my political experience, my observation of what makes political leaders great. So don't expect a horse. Don't expect some other gift. Here is my gift to you. Machiavelli also at the end says, I'm sort of an unlucky guy. I have not been treated very well by fortune. There's a little bit of self-pity at the end of this dedicatory letter. But it is an interesting preface. Only about a page long is this dedicatory letter. But it's an interesting preface, and it does provide one way of contextualizing what this is about. It is important to remember it was written as a treatise to be sent to a member of the Medici family, and the Medici family was ruling both the papacy and Florence at that time. Always a good thing to remember as we turn to the text of The Prince itself. Although it's a short book, it's interesting that sometimes people skim over the first few chapters. It doesn't seem to have a real zing at the beginning. All the famous one-liners are much later on. Today when we teach writing to students, we always say you want to start off with something that really grabs you. And at least from most of our perspectives, Machiavelli does not do that. But I do want to spend some time on these early chapters because I think they're important both in terms of understanding the book generally and also looking at the MO, as they used to say in old detective shows, the method of operation that Machiavelli carries out throughout The Prince. It looks like at the beginning he's going to give us a catalog of kinds of government. He starts off by saying there are, well, a couple kinds of government. There are, after all, governments that are more or less popular regimes, what we would call republics, and there are principalities. There are governments that are, in fact, run by princes. And we need to appreciate the fact that there are both kinds. However, he then goes on to say, I'm really not going to talk about republics because, he says, I've talked about republics at great length somewhere else. Now, leads to an interesting question. Where does he do that? Of course, the answer is he does it in the other work we're going to spend a lot of time discussing, and that is the discourses on the first 10 books of Livy. Aha, we perk up and say, what that means is he's writing these two books simultaneously. If he says, I've written about republics somewhere else, he must be sort of, at least during the time he's writing The Prince, sort of, one day working on one and one day working on the other. Possible. We aren't sure because, remember, again, we don't have his manuscript, and this wasn't published till about 20 years after it was written, and therefore it may simply be that a few years later he went back and inserted that. We do know that he began the discourses not long after he wrote The Prince, and perhaps while he was writing The Prince. But we can't take this statement as absolute proof that they were, in fact, simultaneous works. Okay, so there are republics and there are principalities. We're not going to talk about republics. Now, principalities. Let's make our catalog, our typology of the types of principalities there are. First of all, of course, there are hereditary principalities. King dies, new king takes over. And there are new principalities. And therefore, we need to begin to dissect. We don't just talk about all principalities because what might work for one kind might not work for another kind. This is a subtlety that we very often miss when we read snippets of Machiavelli's The Prince. It simply seems to be a book about princes and how princes should operate if they're going to be successful and powerful and retain control over their principalities. Machiavelli says, hey, there are principalities, and then there are principalities. And although he does talk about all kinds of principalities, most of what he talks about in The Prince is about new principalities. And there's a reason for that. Hereditary principalities are relatively easy, Machiavelli says, after all, to rule. Because if you inherit a principality, presumably from dad or occasionally from a brother or an uncle or whatever, first and foremost, you're going to be successful if you just don't mess things up. What you don't want to do is break old customs. You don't want to come in and say, well, now that I'm king, I'm going to change the way England or Milan or whatever it is has always been. You don't do that. That isn't smart. So it doesn't take great genius or great skills to continue ruling in a hereditary principality. You have custom and tradition and some unchallenged sense of legitimacy on your side. So in many ways, your job is not to screw things up, not to mess things up. And therefore, he says, there are a lot of successful but unremarkable hereditary rulers. Whether it's a king of this or a prince of that or a duke of so-and-so, those folks, if they aren't bad, they're probably going to make it okay. And Machiavelli gives a contemporary example. He cites, seems to us perhaps, a fairly minor figure. He cites the Duke of Ferrara. Ferrara is in the northern part of Italy, a member of the Este family that had ruled in Ferrara a long time. Let me stop and say the world's never as simple as scholars try to make it. And I've talked about the 5 major states of Italy: Venice, Milan, Florence, the papacy, and Naples, the Kingdom of Naples, Kingdom of Sicily. But there are several small, still independent, although not big-time players in Italy. Ferrara would be one. Lucca would be one. Siena always a kind of nemesis to Florence, although more an irritant than a real enemy at this time. Those are all still little independent states. So politics is a little bit more complicated than the five I mentioned. But the Duke of Ferrara, he said, for example, Ferrara is a fairly small state. Venice attacked Ferrara. The papacy attacked Ferrara, but Ferrara survived. Because, in a sense, the Duke was fortunate. He was the heir of a long tradition of Este rulers, and he didn't screw things up. He didn't do bad things. He didn't do dumb things. And so that's sort of enough. Well, having said that, Machiavelli, of course, now turns to non-hereditary states, states that are newly conquered, because these are the tricky ones, because by definition, they break with established tradition. If you go in and conquer someplace, then by definition, you're changing the rules of the game. However that place had been governed before, you aren't just the logical successor or the unchallengeably legitimate successor. You're the new guy in town. And so how do you operate? How, in a sense, do you start ruling from scratch? Now, let me make a broad point here before I go on to talk about this, because this is much of what Machiavelli is interested in The Prince. I said in the very first lecture, they were interested in Machiavelli not just as a figure of the Renaissance, not just even for his historical influence in generations after his, but we're going constantly to ask the question, does Machiavelli have anything to say to us today about politics? As a guide, as a warning, or whatever. How do we make Machiavelli relevant? First of all, we study the text very carefully. You can't do it by pulling a few words out of context and saying, well, as Machiavelli says. Too many newspaper editorials do this. Too many political figures do this. Too many book writers do that. We need to do our homework if we're going to try to do that. But we have to be creative in saying, okay, there is no exact parallel today to a particular situation Machiavelli is talking about. Let's see, though, whether there's some principle here that we can apply in a somewhat, not always perfectly, but a somewhat analogous situation. Let's see if we can find that. So I ask you, as I'm talking about this text, to think creatively, to think in terms of how do I apply this to a somewhat different world. And you may find it applying in elements in the United States, in Europe, in Latin America, in the Middle East. You might say, gee whiz, that sort of gives me an insight, an angle into looking at some particular problem today that I hadn't quite thought of. Machiavelli's not going to give you the answer. He knows that. He's the one who says, in fact, you always have to adjust to every situation because every situation is different. But there are some principles we can try to extract from Machiavelli that might be widely, although creatively, applicable in different situations. From time to time, I hope to point out examples that are important as I think about politics. I might also argue that we don't necessarily only have to apply Machiavelli to government. For example, there's a chapter in a recent book on Machiavelli that's called Machiavelli for the Executive. And therefore, there are other kinds of organizations than simply governments that also have some parallel principles they operate by, parallel to government, that is to say. And so Machiavelli may not be merely an advisor to government office holders, but may also be, in a larger sense, a guidebook for certain kinds of leadership in certain situations. Okay, let's go back to the problem. New states. Somebody has conquered a state or somebody has received a state without it being hereditary or whatever. What do? First of all, you find allies. Okay, you probably aren't going to succeed and survive on your own. You want to find allies, that is to say, in the territory you conquered. Not talking about foreign allies now. You don't just go in and say, hi, I'm the king of the forest. You go in and say, okay, I'm going to fight you and you and you. Let's work. It's not hard to do because, as Machiavelli points out, there are always people in any state who think they're going to be better off under a new regime. So you make some allies, and that helps you gain power. By the way, Machiavelli points out they may not necessarily last very long because you can't do everything they want. In other words, let's say I'm sort of a disgruntled noble in a state, and here comes this new guy marching in. Why might I ally with him? I might say, gosh, he might make me his chief minister. Gosh, he might double my property. Gosh, he might let me alone and give me essential independence and jurisdiction over the area that I've traditionally had control of. That might happen. That'd be great. That'd be good for me. The guy who used to be prince didn't do that. I'm going to back this guy because he will do that. And then, of course, you find out he's got his own ideas. Or he can't make everybody who's his ally prime minister, or give him the best job, or give him more land, or whatever it might be. So you need allies, but you also know they're probably not going to be permanent because you cannot satisfy their sometimes unrealistic expectations. And you cannot accede to all their demands. And so it's important to understand what you need and the fact that you're going to lose those very allies that help you get control. And so Machiavelli makes a very important point here. And that is, therefore, what you need to do is develop the support of the inhabitants, the people, the normal, average, Giovanni and Matilda the peasants, or, the sort of normal, average folks. You need the support of the inhabitants because they're much less fickle and much less demanding than those allies that you needed in order to take over in the first place. It's a very important point that Machiavelli makes because, again, this book's called The Prince, and it's about princes, and it's about tough guys, and it's about tough rule. But notice also Machiavelli says the most secure kind of rule you can have is if you have the people on your side. That's an important principle we sometimes forget about. Now, Machiavelli says, let's make another distinction. Let's say you've conquered a new territory. It matters whether you speak the same language, whether you come from basically, we would say today, the same culture as that territory you're conquering, or whether you speak a foreign language to them, whether you come from a different culture. It matters which one of those is. One is easier than the other. It is relatively easy if the language and culture and customs are the same, because you're pretty far along the way once you eliminate the old ruling family. But if it's a different culture, if it's a different language, you have to have a new set of principles to operate with. Okay? Here's what ideally you should do. Go live in your new principality. And he tells why. First of all, he gives an interesting modern example. He said that's exactly what the Ottomans did when they conquered the Byzantine Empire and the Balkans. The Ottomans didn't just conquer, the Ottoman ruler came to live there. And that made a big difference. And so, if you can, go live there. Secondly, this is important because the people want to see their new ruler. They want to have a sense that they have access to their new ruler because probably they had some access, however courtly it might have been, to their old ruler. They want to see you around. They want you to be a reality and not an abstraction. And third, he says, you need to be on the scene because troubles will arise and you need to spot them. You need to see what the difficulties are. You need to experience them so you can detect them and deal with them as soon as possible. Now, he says, often it's not possible for a ruler to go and live in a new territory because, of course, that person might also rule an old territory. So then what do? The answer? You send colonies. You move groups of people from one place to the other. You have some of your folks living in this new territory. Now, first of all, it's inexpensive. You're not talking about, loading up all the vans of stuff. You're talking about moving normal, average people who don't have very many possessions and settling them in the new territory. Secondly, you don't annoy anybody really powerful. Because, yes, there's some displacement. If these folks are going to get little farms, somebody that has little farms going to lose his little farm. But the people who are dispossessed by the colonies are few in number, and by definition, they're weak and scattered. And therefore, they're not very dangerous. So it is a very good idea, if you can't go there in person, and that's often the case, you send colonists. You have some of your folks move in among those folks. And that's a very good activity. Now, he says that's not enough. You also need to make allies with neighbors of the new territory, but you make allies with neighbors of the territory who are less powerful than you. You don't just say, there's the obvious ally, I'll sign up with that guy, we'll work out a deal. Because if that ally is as powerful or more powerful than you, that will not work in your interest because that other society is not signing up to be your ally for your benefit, but for their benefit. And so what's important is to get less powerful nearby nations, countries, counties, whatever it might be given the situation, to be your allies. That way, they can't get so powerful that they can actually challenge your authority there. Now, Machiavelli gives a good example from the ancient world of how this worked. You may recall from your knowledge of ancient history that in the 2nd century BC, the Roman Republic basically took over the area today we would call Greece. And the Greek city-states were incorporated into a province of the Roman Republic. How did the Romans do that? Well, the point more than any other one that I want to emphasize here is Machiavelli uses an interesting medical analogy. Because the Romans were on the scene, they didn't indeed send colonies. What it means is they were able to see problems when they were tiny problems. Now, Machiavelli says tiny problems are hard to diagnose, but easy to cure. On the other hand, when a problem becomes obvious, it's easy to diagnose, but hard to cure. That's a very smart medical analogy. We all know that. We hear all the time about get this test or that test because early detection is the key. Machiavelli knows that. He knows it medically, and he believes it works politically. When you've got folks on the scene, when you really are paying attention, you say, here is something that could become an ugly problem. We'll deal with it now. But it takes cleverness. It takes intelligence. It takes focus. It takes a way to get knowledge if you're going to diagnose problems early. Because again, when they're just starting, they are hard to diagnose. I think that's a very important principle. Now, Machiavelli takes up this question. He looks at the invasion of the French into Italy, beginning in 1494, and says, let me study the French because they're a good example of how not to conquer a new territory. And Machiavelli actually ticks off as a list things the King of France did wrong in Italy. And it's very interesting because in some sense, think about what Machiavelli's doing here. He wants the barbarians out of Italy. He hates the idea of the French coming in. He's writing this book to a Medici. The Medici lost their power in Florence when the French came in and humiliated Florence, and they drove Piero de' Medici out into exile. So what Machiavelli says is, I don't want the French around, I don't like them, but this is political analysis. The French did 5 things wrong. Let me analyze them. And one of the things you might say is, gosh, I wonder if the French king will ever read this. Because essentially, I'm giving the French king a formula for how to succeed in attacking Italy, in invading Italy. Very interesting that he really is giving a lesson to the French king. He even tells a story about the fact that he was talking to a French cardinal, and the French cardinal was sort of saying, the Italians are not good at a bunch of things. And Machiavelli responds, and the French are not good at statecraft. Little zing there. So Machiavelli sort of looks at what the French did that was wrong. One of the things he says that they did is the Venetians, that is, say, Venice, sort of urged the French to come in because they were in a struggle with Milan. And what the French did was reduce Venice in power, even though Venice had invited them in. That wasn't very smart, Machiavelli says. And so Machiavelli also helps to look at this French setup and say, let me give you some lessons that we can learn. I'm not going to tick them all off. That's what you do when you read the book. But you can see that in many ways what we're seeing in these early chapters is Machiavelli, the systematic thinker. This catalog of kinds of states, and then sort of dividing the catalog into subparts, and then saying, this is the way you do things, this is the way you don't do things. Here's an illustration of how you do things the way the Romans moved into Greece. Here's an illustration of how you don't do that when the French invaded Italy. I want to end this lecture with a fairly careful look at one particular passage in these early chapters of Machiavelli, where Machiavelli takes a look at an ancient event. Alexander the Great. You know, Alexander the Great sort of swoops in and, well, I mean, this is an exaggeration, we all know that, but sort of conquers the world. And one of the questions that we have to ask is, when Alexander died, he was only 33 years old, why didn't that fall apart? Why didn't the areas that he conquered, the Persian Empire, whatever it is, why didn't those folks all rebel against his successors? How were Alexander's successors able to hold on to this territory? And Machiavelli says, let me tell you how I'm going to go about answering that question. I'm going to take a look at two nations today that are very different. And I'm going to analyze them, and I'm going to suggest that one would be easy to conquer and hard to hold. The other would be hard to conquer and easy to hold. And I want to use these contemporary illustrations of what the differences are between a place that's easy to conquer and hard to hold, or hard to conquer and easy to hold. And then, when I learn that lesson from these nations I'm looking at, if you will, up close and personal, where I've got lots of information because these are contemporary, these are nations that are functioning right now, then I think I'm going to have a better historical insight into why Alexander the Great's successors were able to hold on to his empire. Now, you know, very often we think about the fact that what we do is analyze the past and study history, and that gives us some insight into the present. Machiavelli's saying it works the other way too. Let's take a look at the present. Let's take a look at the way things are functioning and see what lessons we can draw from those contemporary situations, and then that might help us to answer some very difficult questions about the past. That there's a kind of dialogue, if you will, the lessons go both ways between the past and the present. It's a very interesting point that Machiavelli makes. Well, what nations are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about the nations of France and the Ottoman Empire. And what he says is, France is a principality, it's a kingdom, but he's used the term principality generally, ruled by a prince and his nobles. You know, France, there are a lot of dukes and counts and all this sort of stuff. Now, he said a place like that is actually pretty easy to conquer because you've always got nobles who are discontented. You can always find some allies inside who say, gosh, I'll back this guy because nasty old king so-and-so is taxing us too much, whatever it is. But, he says, those kingdoms are hard to hold because you can't satisfy all those guys, and those nobles think they're as good as you are. That's what nobles are. I mean, they're hereditary. They've got blood, and they say, what does this guy know about the kingdom? Why, we all have some theory that says we are the equals of the king. Easy to conquer, hard to hold. On the other hand, there is the Ottoman Empire, which is ruled by a ruler and his ministers, people he appoints. There's no traditional nobility. It's hard to conquer because all the guys that have power work directly for and their fortune is related to the power of that ruler. And to conquer it, you've really got to clobber it. But once you conquer it, it's easy to hold. Because of the fact you don't have a hereditary class that says we're as good as them. We're as good as the new rulers. And the Ottoman Empire is the example of that. And therefore, he says, when you look back at Alexander the Great and his conquest of the Persians, what do you discover? Okay? Persia was like the Ottoman Empire. Alexander the Great, it took a hell of a lot of work to conquer it and beat it, but once you beat it, it was beaten. It was conquered. It was yours. One of the most interesting early lessons we learned from the prince.